Hi Rockstars. Okay, so this is a very short video on direct and indirect speech. So hopefully by the end of this, you will be able to understand the differences between number 1 and number 2 here. You can probably notice some differences already. For example, you've got a comma after said, followed by the quotation marks. That's very, very common, so don't forget the comma before direct speech occurs. And obviously in the second example, you can probably notice that there's a word here that isn't in the previous one, and that the pronoun changes here from I becomes he, and also the verbs also change from the present to the past. So just be very, very careful when going through my 4 golden rules, and you will be absolutely brilliant. Now, golden rule number 1 is quite important because it is, in fact, the change of the pronouns as well as the inclusion of the word that, as you have there. So what happens in direct speech is you have Mr. P said, I am not the murderer. But when you want to turn that into reported speech, or indirect speech, as it's also known, you have to say, Mr. P said that. Now this relative pronoun is very, very important, and it always appears in statements of reported speech. So don't forget that word. And also, it's important to remember that Mr. P said, I am not the murderer, will then turn to Mr. P said that he was not the murderer. And it's exactly the same for ladies as well, in the sense that if it was Mrs. Smith, it would be Mrs. Smith said, I am not the murderer. It would turn to Mrs. Smith said that she was not the murderer. So just be very aware of that. So the second golden rule is to do with tenses, as you've got there. So in direct speech, you've got Mr. P said, I am not the murderer. And in the second one, with indirect speech, Mr. Peter said that he was not the murderer. So you've got the change of pronouns for rule number 1, and then you've got the change of tenses for rule number 2. The tense always goes back when it is in direct speech. The third golden rule here is the change of situation. So in the example we've got here, Mrs. Smith said, I did not commit this crime last night. Now if you turn that into indirect speech, there's sort of a greater distance put between the speaker and what happened. So in the example here we've got Mrs. Smith said that she did not commit that crime the previous night instead of this crime last night. So this is an important rule because it's not just the tense and the pronouns that change, but also there's a greater distance put between the person and what happened. So here are some more examples of direct speech words that you would be using, as well as indirect speech words. So if I said to you, I went there this afternoon, if that became reported speech, it would be, he said that he went there that afternoon. So again, just be aware of these words that actually change when you use direct speech, and then if you use indirect speech. Now this is a very important rule with questions and answers, because different types of questions actually affect how they are going to be written in indirect speech or reported speech. So if you look here by the direct speech, John asked Mary, are you going? Now that's a yes or no answer. So in indirect speech, you say, John asked if, or John asked whether she was going. So obviously we've got the pronoun there, as we discussed before. But the key here is you have to use the word if or whether when there is a yes or no type of answer required from a question. Then we have the second type. Now John asked, where is Mary? Now this is a little bit more open-ended. It doesn't have to be a yes/no answer. So it could be, where is Mary? She could be in Oxford. She could be in Cape Town. She could be at home. So in those situations, you have to go to John asked where Mary was. So you can see the differences between the two types of questions there. So just be very, very careful.